Okay. All right. Well, I would like to thank everyone for joining us today at our first academic outreach webinar. And we're hoping to do more of these, in the coming semesters. So this webinar is keeping students engaged, and we have 3 presenters today. But before I get to that, I just want to get your attention on the controls again. So because this is a keeping student engaged webinar, so we expect you to engage with us, and we're going to try to have you interact with us throughout the webinar. So for the first part of the webinar, we're going to be asking some questions, and we would like you to respond via chat. And that's going to be when you mouse over the bottom part, you'll find the chat window. So this is my pretty picture and my colleague's pretty picture. My name is Wala Tatra. I am instructional design and training specialist for academic outreach here at the university. And my colleague, Dr. Deborah Prasad, is also instructional design and training specialist. And she's also teaches for Nova Southeastern University. And we have 2 guest speakers. The first one, also from Ole Miss, Dr. Alice Myatt, assistant professor and assistant chair of writing and rhetoric. She's also academic coordinator of minor in professional writing. She was one of the recipients of the liberal arts summer school online grant, and one of many of her research interests include the key characteristics of effective online learning, and that also include online writing centers. Dr. Michael Simonson from Nova Southeastern University is another guest speaker today, and we are very delighted that he can join us today. Dr. Simonson is Associate Professor of Department of Higher Education and Leadership and Instructional Technology at Nova. He has been pretty active in publishing textbook and publications and giving lots of presentations throughout his career. And in 2016, he was inducted to Hall of Fame of the U.S. Distance Learning Association.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Simonson. So the first question that we have for you is, please type in the chat if you, what kind of classroom have you taught in? Is it face-to-face, online, hybrid? Give you just 1 second. Okay, we have always face-to-face. Okay, all of the above. Face-to-face, all 3 types. Okay, all right, great. So with that, I'm gonna hand it over to my colleague, Dr. Deborah C. Prasad. Let me stop sharing.
Thank you. Okay. Okay, so everyone can see my screen?
You
Yes.
bet.
Thank
Great.
you. Okay, so one has already introduced me, and I think I do know some of you already. So thank you again for attending our webinar. And today I am just going to talk a little bit about engaged learning. Being an instructor myself, I do apply some of these tools that I'll share with you in a few minutes. On the agenda is talking a little bit, discussing what is engaged learning in the online environment. And I've seen from some of the responses that some of us have only taught face-to-face. So I think this would be a good time, if you are planning on teaching online, what exactly you can do, what are some of the changes you can do as you're prepared to teach online. We'll discuss a little bit some of the key elements of engaged learning. How can we design our course to facilitate and promote online engagement? What kind of tools can we use? What activities? And again, we want to create and have activities and assessments in our course that would not come across to our students as just being busy work. We want them to be actively participating. We want to get them motivated. And then I'm going to ask Dr. Simonson to, talk a little bit of how we measure online engaged learning, because as we're doing all of this, how do we know, how can we measure it and see if we're on the right path? Okay. So again, because keeping up with the theme of engaged learning, I'm going to ask you if you can just type in what is engagement that you feel from a student's perspective. We've all been students at some point in time, or maybe we've even taken an online class.
Okay, so we have paying attention, responsiveness to the material, being interested, actively participating, materials that engage more than one of their senses, ability to interact with others, responding to learning with real examples.
Okay, and participating, okay, all right. So based on the responses, and I can get my slide to move to the next one. Here we go. So I think some of what you're saying actually ties in with what I've come up with myself based on my research as well and experience. Students do want timely feedback, feedback if they, so that you can motivate them and get them to the next level. Interest in content, accessible content, motivating, not overwhelming. In a college level course, yes, we do expect that the content will be overwhelming, but we want it to be manageable. So as we design, as we prepare our content for our online courses, we do have to pay attention to that. Breaking that feeling of disconnect, interaction with instructor and classmates, establishing a community of online learning. So from a student's perspective, that is very important. So we'll elaborate a little bit more on that as I proceed, but let's go to the next slide, which is, what is engagement from your perspective? When you are getting ready to teach, when you're designing your course, what are your expectations? What do you think from your perspective? So again, go ahead and type in the chat area and let's see if some of what I've come up with relate to yours.
All right, so we have regular interaction, hear from students at times. Students respond to inquiries from teacher, student meeting deadlines of assignments, student interact with each other, and student have questions about content, quick responses. Oh, these are all great.
Okay, and so I think we do have some similarities, or we are in agreement with some of what you're saying here, at least most of it. Engagement from an instructor's perspective, meeting the needs of our online learners, choosing communication tools. We've got questions about content, so we've got to make sure that we're designing our content, and so we're encouraging them to, interact with the content, think critically. We must have appropriate activities so that those activities will accomplish our desired learning outcomes. We also need to be able to measure and assess our online engaged learning. So how do we get all of this? I've spoken in some very general and broad terms here. So I'll go to my next slide and put it all together for us. And then we'll talk about how we can design it. So based on your interaction with me, your responses, together with what I've shared on my slides, and putting it all together according to Conrad and Donaldson, students, yes, in terms of interaction, what is engaged learning on their part, they do want to establish their own learning goals, and they're able to do this from our syllabus. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. I'm not sure that students like to work in groups, but again, that is a way of keeping your students engaged, have them work in groups, and then providing content that will encourage them to think higher, to, making it tie in more authentically, more real life situation, explore resources to answer meaningful questions. From an instructor's perspective, we've got to make sure that we have tasks, we have activities, our assessment is ongoing and performance-based. Whatever we're producing in the classroom, we can use that outside of the classroom. In my instance, in my online course, the class that I'm teaching, I do Intro to Web Authoring. And one of the things, the project at the end of that course is for them to create a website that they can use in their real life environment, in their own classrooms, okay? So we have talked about what is engaged learning. We know that we've got to design something, we've got to design our content, we've got to provide authentic activities, but all those are in general terms. Let's narrow that down, and where do we start? We start with the syllabus. And according to Simonson, Smaldino, and Zabacek, they indicate that the most important document when you're starting your online course would be your syllabus. It is one of your primary communication with your students. And I do like this. There is no ideal instructional method. So as instructors, you know that if you're teaching face-to-face, and I know I've done this as well, when I'm teaching face-to-face, I can look at my students and know if they have got a glazed look. Do they understand what I'm saying? And then I can adjust and tweak it. We don't have that. Luxury in an online class. So it means that when we start with our syllabus, as we're thinking of our course, we have got to start thinking, how can we keep our students engaged? How can we get them to want to continue learning? You have different roles when you are creating your online course. You're not only an instructor, you're an instructional designer, you are a facilitator, you are a social negotiator, and I'll talk all about that as we proceed, all right? So what I'm trying to say is that you do have to apply a variety of techniques, and your syllabus is your important document. So let's talk about the syllabus now. What are your components of an online lesson? You're going to start with the syllabus. When you're in a face-to-face class, what is the first thing you do when you go into your classroom? You introduce yourself, right? You have a welcome. You want to know, you share with the students what are the objectives. You maybe do a quick review of assignment and due dates, and then you proceed into your content, and then you talk about your activities and assessments. It's the same concept that you're going to use in your online course. And you start with your syllabus, and you, of course, will start with all those components I've just mentioned. So you're going to design now. We have, and I've said this before, we've got different roles that we play in the online environment. There are 4 phases, according to Conrad and Donaldson. And this was actually new for me. I didn't realize that I've really been placed in these roles because I just kind of take it for granted. But there's actually names for this. So phase 1, when your student first enter your course, they're coming in as a newcomer. You are in the role of a social negotiator. I'm not sure if you've heard of the community of inquiry framework that you would design your course with, and Dr. Simonson is going to talk a little bit more about that, so I'm not going to step on his presentation. But as a social negotiator, your role as an instructor from the time that you initiate that contact with your students, you prepare your syllabus, you do a welcome, the tools that you would use, you can use a video, you can have a discussion forum where you allow the students to introduce themselves. Maybe they can post a picture, they can share a little bit personal information. You're really trying to establish a comfortable learning environment so that you're building a relationship with your students, and you want them to feel the same way. They're also building a relationship amongst themselves. So you're in that role of a social negotiator. So that would be maybe your first 2 to 3 weeks of the course. Phase 2 as a cooperator in the student role, and yours as a structural engineer, and I do like that term. That is when you're designing your content. You want to make sure that your content is being delivered in your course, it's accessible. It could be overwhelming, but it should be manageable overwhelming, not overwhelming to the point to distract your students or to distract them from taking the course. So as a structural engineer, you're designing your content, you're planning activities, and assessments. And so your students now is just really cooperating, they're navigating their way in the course. Phase 3, as a collaborator and a facilitator, maybe some of the content that you've created, some of the activities, you want to build that online learning community. So what you've done is you've actually maybe initiated either group work or team them up, have them paired with each other, or through even the discussion forums, you're encouraging them to discuss, to form that community, to exchange ideas, to collaborate with each other. So in phase 3, there are collaborator and you are just facilitating this. And then phase 4, the student role is now initiator, and you are now a committee member as well as you're a challenger. So you are getting them to the next level. I also want to say in phase 4, you are the expert. You are the subject matter expert. So you're guiding them, you're challenging them, you're getting them to that next level. So as you design your course, you think of these 4 phases, and you adapt, or you take on those roles as social negotiator, structural engineer, facilitator, community member, challenger. I'm also going to put in there instructional designer as well. Okay. All right. So we've done all of that. How do we know that we're on the right track? How do we know that is there something, are there guidelines, are there benchmarks? How do we know we have the right amount of interaction, or what is the quality of our interaction? And at this point now, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Simonson after I share where I got my references. And I'm handing it over to Dr. Simonson. So I'll stop sharing. And if there aren't any questions, you've got the floor.
Yeah. Is there any questions so far at this point? I don't see anything in the chat yet. Yes, go ahead, Noah.
Am I on?
Yes, but we have a question, but you can get.
Dr. Simonson, I guess we'll just wait. Oh, here's the question. If your courses is overwhelming, how can you help them? So let's answer this question, and we'll move on to Dr. Simonson.
I get to answer that question?
Oh, sure. Go right ahead.
Well, I think that's an instructional design question, Dr. Simonson. but seriously, maybe we'll touch on that as we talk.
Okay.
We'll touch on a couple of those ideas. I like what you said about a class should be overwhelming, but not overwhelmingly overwhelming. Is that what you said?
Yes.
Can you see my screen?
Overwhelming.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Thank you. And I feel a little funny here because the experts on this are the 2 professionals that have invited us to speak. Dr. C. Prasad and Juan are true experts in this area. So I'm flattered to be asked to come and talk a little bit about my observations about this idea of engagement. By the way, Nova Southeastern University is in Fort Lauderdale. It's 10 miles from the beach. I got 2 medical schools in oceanography, law, business, 25,000 students, but nobody's heard of us because we don't have a football team or a basketball team for that matter, Division II. At any rate, I appreciate this opportunity to come up to Oxford via Zoom and talk a little bit about a very important topic. I'd like to talk about the definition. I always like to go back and look at the roots of these things, even though I think I know what they are. The purpose of this engagement idea, as is my nature, talk a little bit about theory, and then give you some examples, which is probably the most important part of what I'll be talking about. Well, when you look at engagement, we can look at it from a number of perspectives. Getting married, putting your automobile in gear. I guess we don't do that so much anymore. It happens automatically for us. But remember in the old days when you shift your car into second. A hostile involvement between military forces. Actually, the definition I think we're talking about is what in bold at the bottom, which you can read for yourselves. But what is the commonality of all these definitions? Well, It's serious business, obviously. Getting married, maybe putting your car in gear isn't as serious as a hostile encounter, but it's serious business. And it also means that it's connected. There are things happening between more than one individual. There's an expectation for change, and there are multiple participants, partners, if you would. We here at Nova Southeastern University have just gone through a faculty engagement activity. Maybe you're doing the same thing. Gallup has been on campus polling the faculty to find out whether we're really engaged with the mission of the university. Businesses do the same thing. It's kind of a popular idea. I think in education, and in online instruction, we're taking a more narrow view than maybe the Gallup people are. But it is an important activity. It is an important topic. There are some synonyms. Did I spell that right? We talked about communities of inquiry. Another phrase often used is learning communities, the idea of social presence. Another way to try to get to the bottom of some of these ideas is to look at the antonyms. Are antonyms the opposite of the term? Help me, you English teachers. Things like words like isolation, individual, teaching versus learning. Those may be other ways to help us identify what we're really concentrating on when we talk about engagement and student engagement. There is even engagement theory. I can see everybody's eyes starting to glaze over now. But this helps us get a perspective also on what we mean by engagement. Those who write about these things and study it say it's in a group context, it's project-based, it's authentic. And maybe to clarify that a little bit, when we talk about a group context, it means that more than one person is involved. It's not an individual tutorial when we talk about engaging people. It's easy to engage on a one-on-one basis, but we're talking about bringing groups together. The project base usually means there are artifacts, and the artifacts might be a case study, even though I think probably most of you know that the research is pretty clear that case studies don't produce improved achievement in our students. The direct instruction method, most of us would call that lecturing, is virtually the same as case study research. What is different is the level of engagement. So when we talk about engagement, we shouldn't be attempting to make the case that our students are going to learn more. But we can make the case that they'll probably be more engaged, which then may lead to peripheral learning or additional learning beyond what the basic objectives are in our class syllabus. And as I said, as Dr. Sieper has said, there are scales to measure achievement. The Gallup people have nice ones, but there are also classroom scales to see if your students are really involved. One actual, and those scales are standardized, is assignments that involve students with content and with each other, with the purpose of making students take responsibility for their own learning. We've all talked about student-centered learning and getting students to take their own learning. And I think almost any instructional strategy will allow that to happen. But when we talk about engagement and engagement theory, it really comes to the fore. Well, let's give some examples. As Dr. Sieper said and Juan have said, group projects, students dislike them. That doesn't mean we shouldn't have group projects. Students just kind of dislike them because they think, well, either they're doing more work and some people are riding on their expertise, or they're not getting a chance to have their expertise highlighted in the group work. But it's a fact of life now that in higher education, we're expected to have some group projects, if not in every course, at least in our curriculum. One of the techniques that is reported and is quite effective is at the conclusion of any group activity, have the members of the team or the group or the learning community rate one another anonymously. In other words, take the 5 people, give them some kind of a rating, either a scale or a rank, who did the most, who did the least, and then not necessarily use that to grade students, but it helps students, if they know they're going to be rated or ranked, to become more engaged in that team activity. Peer reviews are another example. Instructors dislike peer reviews, at least that's what the literature tends to say, not everybody, because it often can produce potential conflict. You know, all the students love this, But I didn't, because they really missed the point. It was well written, it was articulate, but they missed the point about this theoretical approach that I wanted students to talk about. Is education a profession, for example? And there's also coordination issues. Once again, peer reviews are an excellent technique to promote engagement, but we have to identify that there are potential issues to be related there. And then multiple channels of communication. Everybody likes, it's all about connections, okay? Linking us together, making us feel connected. In a traditional classroom, one of the most effective techniques to engage students is the proximity approach. Elementary teachers are great at this. If they want to really connect with a child in a third grade classroom, what do? They walk up right next to them and talk to them, even if they're talking to the whole class. That proximity approach is an excellent one. Well, how do you do that in an online environment? Well, let's think about how you do that, but that's an excellent technique. Connecting, being close to. Welcome audios and videos, not just from you to your students, but from your students to each other. Helps them know who everyone is and know that they are being known. Now, sometimes you may want to keep that behind the wall, security wall, a blackboard, so that it's not like a Facebook page that everybody takes a look at, but those are very effective. Interviews with classmates, where classmates interview one another to talk to them about an assignment. And this can be back up to the peer review activity. A regular communication from you. Matter of fact, the rule of thumb is, Juan, is every student should receive 3 communications per week as a minimum from their instructor. Now, that doesn't mean you have to call them up on the phone and talk to them 3 times a week. It can be a Monday morning memo. The Monday morning memo where you talk about what we're going to do for the next week or what we did the last week. Or it can be an individual contact. But 3 is kind of what the research tends to say is if you do at least 3, you're probably going to have a more engaged student. Individual project and posting and rating. Remember your elementary teacher again. What's the book? You learn everything in 3rd grade or kindergarten or something like that. What do elementary teachers do? They take the student's project, the finger painting, for example, and they post it on the wall. Well, post student assignments. Now, we worry a little bit about students will copy one another. Well, that's a different issue. You can obviously overcome that. But when they start to see that there are other people doing that same project on visual literacy, for example, and they see it that student's perspective, that draws them into the learning community. And then group examinations, where students have to complete the examination as a team. By the way, this note at the bottom, I really didn't know this either. I kind of suspected, but as I was preparing for this presentation, I found a couple of excellent articles that talked about social media, you know, Facebook and Snapchat and all that. And these social media oftentimes have been found not to foster engagement because of the perception that the student has about Facebook as a personal social media activity versus the educational purposes. They kind of mix up the two. So if you're going to use social media, there has to be a clear delineation between what they do socially and what they do educationally with the social media. Let's see. That's all I have to say about that so far. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we'll move on.
Okay,
Hey,
so I
right,
have a
15 minutes
question.
too.
Yes, I have a question. That was very good. So
Thank you.
Noah asked the question of if she has a class where they have to learn more than 100 drugs or tests. And
Yeah.
I know that you've dealt with the School of Pharmacy at Nova, so I thought maybe this would be a good opportunity. Maybe you can help her a little bit, even though it's an
Here's
instructional
another
design
project.
question.
I've got a book over here called Combat Fleets of the World, and it's about that thick. And naval ensigns at the Surface Warfare Officer School have to memorize that entire book. And there is no class that teaches it. They're just given the book and say, memorize all the facts about all the fleets of the world. You know, how fast the ships go, how big they are, the personnel, the guns, and all that stuff. Well, obviously, people don't memorize the whole book. So what do? They begin to distinguish what are the commonalities, what are the themes across this mass of seemingly discrete information, and they begin to identify those themes so that they can remember what needs to be remembered. And so instead of memorizing the TENS tables, you learn about, or the pharmacology table, you learn what are the commonalities across. It's a matrix, in other words. The 10 tables, once you learn 1 through 10, I mean, you can go up, count up to 100 billion if you want to. And so that's the approach that works when there is more content that can be taught. And of course, you don't teach every one of those, but we prepare students by having them learn the themes across, and then they learn the specifics, and they will learn to prioritize. And the physician desk reference, for example. I don't think there's a doctor in the world, a pharmacist in the world that knows everything that's in the physician desk reference, another big book. But they know what the themes are. They know how to find things. And so we could talk about whether an assessment on those 100 pharmacological items is a good exam, or whether we could talk about how you teach those kinds of things that they understood. And that's I'm sure that'll be another seminar for a webinar for another day, Dr. Simonson.
Thank you.
And by the way, the Ensign Center given an exam at the end of their 15 weeks of their division officer school. They don't know what the questions are. And instead of the average score on that 100 question exam is about 75. So that means they learn about 75%, or they can at least, on an objective recall test, score at about 75%. Is that good or bad? Well, that's an instructional activity, an objective activity. Thanks for asking.
You're welcome.
Yeah, we have another question from Mary, and then we'll move on to Dr. Myatt. So Mary asks, is there a way for students to share on Blackboard their work so other students can see it? What about the number of projects they'll see in a large class? Can you only have them see some students' work, not all?
Dr. Seeker said, you taught me that, where students can't see someone else's posting until they made a posting themselves.
Right, that's one way. You can actually use the discussion area and share the work. You can assign a student to be a moderator of that forum. But Mary, there are tools within Blackboard. The most common one I'm going to say is the discussion area, or even a wiki. You can create a wiki and have students share their work in the wiki and be able to comment and add to that content. So wiki is another great way of sharing.
Okay, all right. So I'm going to share my screen again, and this time it's going to be Dr. Myatt's slides. So if you would, Alice, you would let me know when you want to advance the slides, and I'll do this for you.
Okay, that's great. I appreciate it. And before I get into my material, I wanted to piggyback off of what Dr. Sapersan was saying, and that is, I also, when I want to share students, I want them to be able to share their work, I'll use the groups feature as well. I'll set them up in groups and give them access to all the tools, and that allows them to share their work also just within their group. And it gives them things they can email, they can set up their own discussion boards, they can even have their own wikis. So just as she was saying, so it's really a good thing to do. Okay, so yes, I'm Alice Myatt. I have been working with learning and teaching in online environments since 2007. And I was really fortunate to have that grant opportunity because it put me with the instructional designers. And so some of what I do now has become really embedded in my teaching so that I sometimes don't think about it. And so this was a good opportunity for me to think about the things that I do. And my particular focus for this morning is just to talk about some of the tools and some of the strategies, and not quite so much dig into the theoretical or the scholarship side, because I think that our presenters have done a wonderful job in doing that, and I really appreciate being part of this morning. We started off by talking about the syllabus, and one thing I wanted to say about the syllabus online is, yes, it's really important, and and I seem to have always struggled with how do I know that students have actually read and understood the syllabus. Some instructional designers will do a quiz and have students take a quiz, and that's good for the moment. One of the things that I tried this time around to see if it would be any different was I actually put students in groups on using the discussion boards, and I told them they had to review the syllabus and they had to find questions, and they also had to find the due dates. And so that as a group they had to dig into the syllabus, and then they had to talk about it, and then they had to post about it. So I tried to make it more of a living document. We'll just see if we'll see if it sticks. I don't know. But I guess where I'm going with that is always look for ways that you can get your students to interact and respond and talk to each other using all of those tools. But so the next thing is the welcome video. I try to always post a welcome video. I don't particularly like looking at myself, but that doesn't mean that students wouldn't like to have some sense of who I am. So here specifically at the University of Mississippi, we have something called Studio One, where the instructional designers and academic outreach, oops, go ahead. Oh, I see. Well, just go back. That's all right. Well, they'll come and help me, do a video. And so wherever you are, you probably have someone on your campus that's like that. And I try to combine the professional and the personal. They want to know who I am as an instructor. They want to know my credentials. Am I actually going to be doing good academic work for them, but they also like to know a little bit about me as a person. So I happen to have dogs, and so I always make some reference to my dogs, and I show some pictures of my dogs. And some people don't want to be a talking head, and if that's the case, then I suggest that they use screenshots of their syllabus, or they can put up an assignment overview. They can use photos as appropriate, and then they can do a screencast if they don't particularly want to do a straightforward welcome video. Even a screencast would work. So next slide would be great. Other strategies, I begin interacting with students even before class begins. And if it's possible for you to do that, I strongly recommend it, because a lot of engaging students is understanding who your students are. So I send a welcome email before class ever begins. I ask for a reply. I ask them to respond back to me, and it only takes me a few minutes to dash off a quick response that says, "It's great to hear from you. I'm glad you're in my class, and I look forward to talking with you." But also establishes the expectation on my side that they're going to hear from me by email, and it gets them used to understanding the role of email and what they do. I also send out a brief survey, and I'll ask them for their prior experience with either the course content and goals. I'll invite comments about their expectations and concerns for the course. I ask them if it's okay for me to text them. I also ask when is a good time for them to meet with me. And I'll come back to that, I think, on a different slide, but just hold that thought. I just thought, what's a good time for you to talk with me online about this course? So anyway, and then when I reply to the students, I always use their names. And when they do that survey, if they want to be called by a middle or a nickname, I try to make that as well. So if I use their name a lot, not only does it start associating their name with who they are, with their online persona with me, then it gives them the idea that I actually care about them. So that's part of what I do at the beginning. Then some of the tools that encourage the instructor-student interaction, and some of this is specific to the University of Mississippi and Blackboard, but I think you'll find equivalents, whether you're using Moodle, Desire to Learn, or Canvas, or other LMSs. I think you'll find equivalent tools. But an example, these are the things that I do, and I do them regularly. I have students set up a writing journal. This journal, I know that you have options as to whether you can share with the class, share with the instructor. I always use the writing journal as a private space between me and the student. If I were teaching face-to-face, students would have the ability to come up after class, stand right beside where I am and say, Dr. Myatt, I have a question. And it would just be the two of us together. They can't do that in an online environment. So I set up the writing journal, and I establish a clear expectation that this is a space between them and me. And as long as they make regular entries, they're going to receive a good grade on that writing journal. The only reason they wouldn't get a good grade on the writing journal is if I have 14 weeks and they send me 10 entries. they, and I just tell them, you do the math. You're not going to make an A in the writing journal. But if you make a regular response, not only will they write to me, but I'll write back to them. Another way sometimes I have a regular prompt and sometimes I make it open. I'll say, this is an open week in your writing journal. Please talk to me about any concerns you have or about things that you've learned, things you want me to know. And again, when I leave it open like that, most of the time I'll get several paragraphs from students. And it's amazing to me how much they'll write when you don't put constraints on their writing, let's put it that way. When students submit their assignment, in Blackboard anyway, there's a place for them to send me a comment. So I can build into the assignment. I can say, when you submit this assignment, post or tell me how you found your resources. Tell me what your concerns are. Tell me what you think I should look for as I read your work. This starts the commenting and the interaction at the very beginning when they send their work in to me. And then I respond back to that. The other thing I can do is I use the inline commenting tool in Blackboard. I use their names, and basically what I'll do is have this interaction with them. And I think I've got some examples in the next slide, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And I always respond to anything interesting. I hope you can see this on the screen. I tried to make it so that it was, readable. These are excerpts from the inline comments that I make when I'm grading and reading work from students. And all of these, for the most part, come from the very beginning of my comment section, because sometimes I have to address real concerns, and I didn't particularly go into that. But as I say, I begin with the positive when I ask students to write. And some of the things that I do, I use their names. I'm specific. So for example, in this middle one where I say to Samuel, I say the AA example remains a strong example, a reminder of what happens when lack of ethics permeates an organization. So I am addressing specifically something he said. And by the way, when I start doing this and I start grading, also on my screen is an open Word document. And as I make a comment, I copy and paste it into the Word document. And so what happens, especially in a larger class, I noticed that someone earlier said that they may have up to 100 students. And I recently taught a class of 55 master's accounting students. And we had them doing writing every week. And yes, the time it took to respond was a little bit, it had to be budgeted. But what I learned was a lot of these students, because it's a cohort, that I'm saying the same things to the same students. And so I would have that, I would just copy and paste it back to someone else, but then I would shift it up a little bit so that it was personal. I always read their entries, make connections to the course content, and then I ask them questions. For example, was any of this new or clarifying regarding effective writing for you? Here's one of my favorites. When I come across something that's really good, I'll say, may I use this in a future class? This is really an outstanding example of what I wanted this assignment to accomplish, and I'd like to share it with future students. Why do I like that so much? It's because they'll respond back to me. And so that lets me know, we talked earlier about what makes students engaged. Well, when they're reading those little comments, that really tells me that they're engaged. And then they respond back to me and they're like, sure, yes, you can use my work. They really like that. And so how I support this is I'll do some screencasting. I'll just do a screencast that says, here's how to find where I put my comments. And I'll do, and then during our online office hours, I'll say, have you been reading my comments? And if they say, yes, I have, or if they refer to it, then I know. If they're like, comments? What comments? I'm like, okay, well, we're together. Let's do this together. I want you to go into your grade book. I want you to look at this last assignment and find the comment that I left for you there, because I'll leave everyone at least a brief comment. So again, that promotes the interaction. So I'm ready for the next one. These strategies for online engaged learning, I'll go through this rather quickly because I want everyone to have time to ask questions. But these are the things that I've come in response. If you assign group work, build in reporting back out to you. That keeps the lines of communication open and you know what's going on. It's easy to do online office hours because when I send them that first survey, I say, when is a good time for us to meet? What I generally find is that students have shared overlaps. of time. And so what I'll do is I'll put people into groups. For example, the current class of 16 that I'm teaching is divided up into 3 times across the week for 1 hour. And they are supposed to meet with me during this time. If I'm introducing a new assignment, we always talk about the new assignment. And then non-paper based projects, even for writing, absolutely. If there's something that they can do that is digital in nature, that's really good. And then I've got all these tools down here that we use. And in the interest of time, because I think you'll have access to this afterwards, is there one more slide, or is that the last one?
And this is the last one.
Okay, this is the last one. Okay, good. Something I would like to give good mention to is the Open Google Doc. It's great for immediate work. And I actually had an example of what I used in one of my classes. And Adobe Connect is something that I'm using for the first time this semester. The instructional designers kind of connected me up with that, but it gives me the ability to have breakout spaces in real time so that I can put students into their meeting rooms. And what I do is I give them short, small, low stakes activities to begin with so that they build that group and they build that sense of community, and then it can transfer into more complex work later on in the semester. So those are just some of the things I do to keep my students engaged. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you, Alice. So we have a couple of questions. I think Valerie's question has been, Deborah has answered the wiki questions already in the chat. Randall's question: in face-to-face courses, I would bring in artifacts from my day-to-day. Well, that's not a question, it's just a comment, sorry. Police report, crime scene photos, having planned that out for the entire semester has been difficult at times. So do we have suggestions for him?
Well, this is Alice, and if I were asking students to bring in artifacts from something like that, and you may do this already, so pardon me if I'm stating the obvious, but I would make that in my syllabus. I would put that this was an expectation. I would have a very early online office meeting with the students to find out what obstacles they would have in finding that. And then, as you said, having to plan that out for the entire semester. That part I totally understand. And I think establishing good communication, I think a reference was made to the Monday morning memo earlier. Having regular and talking to students 3 times a week, which, by the way, I wrote that down. 3 messages, 3 times a week. That's my new goal. Anyway, because I achieved that easily with some students, but others perhaps not. So if you have that regular messaging and you have that regular communication and you establish that at the beginning, I think it might be easier for you to adjust your schedule. And sometimes we think, and others may have a different opinion, but here's my opinion. I always tell students that the calendar we have is a plan. It's wonderful to stick to it. And some things I don't break. Some due dates, because they're learning online. And so there's some things I don't break. But then sometimes the content might change. The deadlines won't, but the content might. I don't know if that helps or not.
Back when I was a young assistant professor, my department chair told me that when my class began, I should have everything that I'm going to be using to teach in a box. And that was a metaphorical box. But he said, put everything in this box, Simonson, so that we know what it is you're going to be sharing with students. And this was face-to-face instruction. And so I didn't have a box, literally, because I taught a lot of production classes and technology classes. But the concept there was that, and as a matter of fact, some of the earliest Blackboard-like course management system was called Course in a Box. So they were trying to convey that idea. So if I'm going to be using materials, my boss told me that he thought it was best is to supplement with current events, but build your course around not historical isn't the right word, but those materials that you know you are going to use and you have access to before the beginning of the class. And so once again, this is a design question, and we've got at least 2 experts in our group that talk about how you go about filling that box up with stuff. But I've always remembered, his name was Diltz, I've always remembered his admonitions to me about how I was supposed to teach. And he never said, you got to do this, Simonson, although I got that impression sometimes. But he rather gave suggestions. And then I would, in my naive way, when I was an assistant professor or even today, I would try to implement them. So maybe you want to have these artifacts from your day as a court officer from previous examples and then supplement that by the current events of the day. So those materials can be posted. I don't know if that helps, but it's a suggestion.
Thank you, Dr. Simonson. So as a summary, I just do a recap of what we've talked about today. We've defined engagement, and we've looked at engagement from student instructor perspectives. We've looked at design for engagement that begin with syllabus, and we want to get students engaged. We want to get interaction. We want to get their participation. And we in terms of group work and peer review, those even though some people may not like it, they usually generate good engagement. There are strategies to also try to get students involved, and a lot of those also include feedback from instructors, and that should be positive, personal, specific, and we also look at some tools that can be used to engage with students. All right, so at this point, if you would like to just, I'm going to open the mic to all of you. If you want to have any question, conversation, anything that you want to ask our guest speakers and our presenters today.
I think I want to just say something about the content from a design perspective. When we have a lot of content, and I think that was one of the questions, and Dr. Simonson did answer some of it, but I also believe that when you're doing your content, when you're presenting your content, use of videos, like a single concept video, you just have one idea, and then maybe you find some way of reiterating it or making sure that they understand that, then you move to the next topic. But single concept videos, personally, I think that they work fine. For me, I cannot be engaged with a video for more than maybe 5 minutes. The minute I see a video, 3 to 5 minutes, if not, I eat everything that is around me. So single concept videos is a good way of chunking and putting your content in manageable amounts and sustainable. Anyone else can add to that, please.
Another content story. One of my best friends was a chemistry professor. And if you've ever seen a freshman chemistry book, those, speaking of big books, they're very big. He and I were talking one evening, I think we were at happy hour or something. He says, geez, I don't know what I'm going to do. I've still got 350 pages to cover in the chemistry text, and I've only got 3 weeks left in this semester. I'm just going to have to rush through things very quickly. And I laughed, and I had enough sense not to tell him that was the silliest thing I'd ever heard. But once again, I think we all realize that in instruction, we don't cover content. In instruction, what we do is we try to provide those entry points to content so that what we study can be understood. Think of the periodic chart of the elements. I mean, we all probably in chemistry had, speaking of chemistry analogies, which I'm on right now, or comparisons, sooner or later we had to memorize, but the periodic chart of the elements is organized so that we can understand it better. You got the inert gases on one side, for example. So we can understand that a little better, and that's what instruction, again, getting into a webinar down the road, Juan and Dr. Sieber said that rather than covering every page in the chemistry textbook, we cover what the approaches, the basic themes that the chemistry textbook has, and let that book be a reference for the specifics.
Valerie has a good question here. If one is using a plethora of tools already, videos, discussion board, etc., how do you move students from the attitude of online courses, that courses are easy and just check marking the box? Anyone? How do you change their attitude? I don't know. Don't think I have much experience that way.
Well, I don't have experience in that area either, but I would think that it would start off with the instructor's expectation of what you expect the students to do and be doing in the course. And that again goes back to the syllabus and what, and that is where you set your expectation.
And
I think that's also tied into what we just have a online faculty cohort starting just last week, and they are also talking about how to vary assignments to keep students interested, and that's one of their questions too. So motivation.
Coming back to keeping them engaged.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone have any other comments?
I'm trying to get my mind around easy and what that means. I guess the specifics are probably, we'd need to, on a instructional design staffing, we'd have to talk about why students think something is easy. Is it because they know it already, or is it because it's so well organized anybody could understand it, even Simonson? Or is it mean I'm not covering enough? I guess there's so many definitions of easy. I got to think about that one a little bit.
One of the definitions of easy I run into is that students, before they take okay, back up for just a minute. I teach writing online. And so I've actually had this particular challenge from the very beginning of us putting writing courses online, because they are by their very nature more intensive and they take longer and they're not a content course. So I'm just going to speak from that one particular angle, and that is I have students in the past who've been able to go into an online course. They're assigned one chapter, 2 discussion boards, 1 reading quiz, and move to the next chapter. And that's their work. And they're accustomed to blocking out perhaps 1 or 2 hours at the most to cover all of that. And then even for their midterms and finals, it's very clear, because they're engaging with a content course, and we are not. We're teaching writing, and it's process based, and it's product based. And Dr. Simonson keeps referring to the project, and that's what they're all projects. And so I just have to tell them up front, I have learned that when a student signs up, that's one of the things that I tell them. This is not a content course. You're going to have to turn in multiple drafts. And because you're going to turn in multiple drafts, you're going to be it's going to take you a lot of time. And I just have to address that up front. I don't know if that gets at what you were asking about or not, but that's one approach.
There's another observation, and it's a rule of thumb. That helps when we're designing courses. And once again, we're probably getting ahead of ourselves. And that rule of thumb is that the average student in a 3-semester level college class should spend about 130 hours interacting with the course. Now, what does that mean? Well, I'm not sure what that means, but 130 hours of time. In other words, we should design the course so it takes a student, the average student, some more, some less, about 130 hours over 16 weeks. What does that mean? Or 15 weeks? That means about 8 or 9 hours a week. If we were in a traditional class, that means we'd go to a 50-minute class session 3 times a week, and for every hour we're in class, 50-minute hour, we'd spend 2 hours outside of class. And that's the same for an online course. We should design our course, even if there is no face-to-face instruction, so that the typical student is interacting with the course. And we define that on all the different kinds of things we expect them to do for about 130 hours.
All right, so we have another question, and she's looking for advice, because LM Hansen. So any advice for foreign language learning online? How to make sure online learning is effective and engaging for an inherently communicative subject?
Boy, if you can teach writing online, and I think that's probably, wow. A foreign language, isn't that how everybody learns it when they don't go to school anymore, is online?
Yeah. Well, I guess, if I can remember when I started learning English, and that's That's a long time ago. I think a combination of everything would actually help me, because when you learn a new foreign language, it's not just writing and reading, it's also listening and speaking. And if you really want them to be able to do all those things, which I assume that that would be your course objectives, for the students, being able to speak, read, write, and understand. So it's going to be all of those, all of the multimedia that would help, and also maybe scenarios and a lot of practice. To do that online, that's going to take some work, but it can be done. It's going to be a lot of probably recording and having students either doing a scheduled conference session with you, or have them record and send you back. I'm just talking in terms of audio and video, and speaking and listening, because writing, in terms of dealing with writing online, is pretty quick with that already.
Before we go, I want to thank you two again. You got me out of a faculty retreat. So I forgot to mention that, but thank you very much, because I'd be in a faculty retreat right now. Oops.
Well, and thank you both also, and Dr. Simonson, for all these good reminders and ways to kind of like help me think again about my classroom setup, and how, because sometimes we get into a routine and we just need we need to get out of the routine sometimes. That's been very helpful. Okay. And actually, from me to my University of Mississippi colleagues, thank you for your support in helping me with my classes. It's been really, really wonderful to have that help.
And if our participants, if you're interested in our next workshop, it is going to be a face-to-face workshop in April in the Jackson Avenue Center. So, and that's going to be Wednesday, April 18th, and Tuesday, April 24th. And we also, Debbie and I offer ID Clinic, and that's, for this semester, it's going to be every Wednesday from 1:30 to 3:30, also at the Jackson Avenue Center. So thank you very much for joining us today. And we're going to send out a survey to participants, and we'll just hope to do more of this with you. Thank you. And thank you all the guest speakers.
Thank you, everybody.
Au revoir, mes amis.
Okay.